This is Comics vs. Show for The Walking Dead, Season 6, Episode number 7 and 8. If you're new to Comics vs. Show, it's just where we take an episode or two from The Walking Dead on AMC and compare it to the comics. This is in no way saying which is better. I love both the comics and the show. This is just a fun series where we look at some of the similarities and differences. Obviously not all the similarities and differences, as that would take way too much time. It's just the ones that pop out to me and the ones that I really want to talk to. And if you notice things that I don't talk about, you can always write them in the comments below. Also, minor spoiler warning, there is somebody that gets bit in the comics that hasn't been bit in the show. I don't think they're going this route anymore because the event where he was bit has already passed. But if you don't want any type of potential spoilers, I may not watch this video. But again, I don't think it's a big deal because I don't think they're actually going this route in the show. Alright, first, the placement of the main characters is different between the shows and the comics. In the show, we see Abraham and Glenn are outside of Alexandria. In the comics, all the main characters, save Andrea, are inside Alexandria. That includes Glenn and Abraham. However, even though Glenn does start inside of Alexandria when the herd event begins, he does end up outside of the walls when he goes on a rescue mission along with Spencer and Heath to save Andrea. Which ties into number 2. In the show, Spencer attempts to get out of Alexandria with a grappling hook and rope in the hopes of getting to a vehicle and leading the walkers away from Alexandria. In the comics, Spencer uses a rope and grappling hook to help a character trapped outside the wall. But even though Spencer uses a rope and grappling hook for different reasons in the comic, some of the shots in the show and the comic are very similar to the comic panels, such as him working his way across the rope, and when the rope snaps and he scrambles up the wall to get away from the walkers. Also, in the comics, as mentioned before, Spencer went out with Heath and Glenn to rescue Andrea with the approval of Rick. Show Spencer went out without telling anyone, and definitely without Rick's approval. Because of this rescue mission, in the comics, Spencer, Glenn, and Heath are outside the walls of Alexandria trying to save Andrea when the herd actually breaks through the walls, unlike in the show where we see Glenn was already outside, Abraham was already outside, and Heath and Spencer are inside the walls when the herd breaks in. Alexandria is surrounded by the herd, and eventually the tower falls down, destroying the wall. Then the walkers flood in. In the comics, Alexandria is surrounded by walkers, and eventually the pressure of them pushing on the wall causes the panel to come loose. They try their best to hold it back and in place, but eventually the walkers put enough pressure and break through, and then they start to come in. The walker breach of the wall is also handled differently in the comics than what we saw in the show. In the show, everyone is told almost immediately to run to their houses and stay inside. Rick tries to hold some back, and the leader of Alexandria tries to help him. In the comics, Holly goes and gets Rick, informing him the wall is down. Then a number of them try to hold the walkers back, including Rick and Morgan. Holly continues to go around warning people and trying to bring them to the wall to help keep the walkers at bay, and eventually even Michonne shows up. And what's way different in the comics is that Rick actually wants people to come out of their homes or where they are to help kill the walkers as they stream in. He doesn't want them to retreat to their homes like we see in the show. However, someone ends up getting bit, and it requires a few of them to retreat to Rick's house for medical help. Luckily, Abraham shows up with some people and they take over for them, cutting down walkers. And it is such a cool scene. So I definitely consider this a big difference between the comics and the show. The show, Rick's immediately get in your houses, get out of here, and he's trying to hold them back and allowing people to get away. And in the comics, he wants people to come out of their homes and come to the wall where there's the breach and help keep the walkers at bay. Where is each character? In the show, the leader of Alexandria, Rick, Carl, Ron, Gabrielle, and Michonne flee to Jesse's house except for a few characters. There, they try to think of a plan to deal with the walkers. In the comics, Rick, Morgan, Carl, and Michonne head to Rick's house where Jesse and Ron have been staying since the herd showed up outside of Alexandria, for protection, and so Jesse could put some sweet, sweet moves on Rick. Maggie shows up at the house when the walkers make it deeper into Alexandria, and Abraham and his group can no longer hold them back. Gabrielle is not with Rick in the comics, but in his church, where Eugene shows up with Nicholas for protection against the walkers now in Alexandria. In the comics, the leader of Alexandria is also not with Rick, and let's talk about the leader of Alexandria in the comics versus the show now. In the show, the leader of Alexandria gets bit while trying to help Rick when the wall comes down. She retreats with him to Jesse's house. Eventually, the group leaves the house with Deanna remaining behind with a gun to take her own life when she's ready. Instead of using the gun on herself, When the walkers get into the house, she decides to go out with a bang, taking down as many as she can before they overwhelm her and, I'm assuming, tear her apart. But the comics leader of Alexandria is in his home when the herd gets into Alexandria, and he's very messed up, saying he's killed them all. He thinks about killing himself and goes outside with the walkers, pointing a gun to his head. But instead he sees Rick and them outside and starts firing wildly into the herd. The leader is then torn apart by the walkers. So I guess in a way, both leaders of Alexandria do fire into zombies, trying to take out as many as they can before being torn apart. But the main difference is Deanna was bit beforehand, was dying, and decided to go out with a big bang, last hurrah. And the leader of Alexandria in the comics was wanting to kill himself, went outside, put the gun to his head with the walkers surrounding him, and then last minute decided to start firing into the walkers before they tear him apart. I already talked about Carl and Ron in other Comics vs. Show, but the fight definitely didn't happen in the comics, or Ron attempting to shoot Carl. In the show, Carl says, "Yeah, my dad killed your dad, but your dad was an asshole." In the comics, the dialogue is a bit different. Ron asks Carl why Carl's dad is good and his dad was bad. Carl says he doesn't know. And that's the end of it. But like I've said in other Comics vs. Show, they've aged up Carl and Ron in the show to be teenagers, and teenagers are going to respond differently to things than kids are. Lastly, let's talk about walker ponchos. The walker guts coating to escape the house and herd does happen in the comics, similar to the show. In the comics, they spend the night in Rick's house after the wall comes down. But the next morning, a walker is tapping on their window, and they realize it will draw others, and eventually the house will be breached. Rick says they have to go, but Rick is actually planning on leaving the other families and children stuck in their houses behind, saying he can't do anything for them, and besides, they aren't our children. In a huge contrast, in the show, Rick says they have to get out of the house the same day, and really almost shortly after the wall comes down. But show Rick is trying to get them to the armory so they can fight off the walkers and help other people in Alexandria. So I guess what I'm saying is show Rick is a little bit less of a dick than comics Rick was at this point. In the comics, Rick, Michonne, Ron, Carl, and Jesse coat themselves in walker ponchos and walk out. Denise is there too, and Michonne is escorting her to her infirmary so that she can help other Alexandrians. Rick, Carl, Jesse, and Ron form a chain, and then Ron freaks out, wets himself, and starts calling out his mom, drawing attention. Which I will stop with what happens there to not potentially ruin it for non-comic readers. In the show, this is almost identical. They end up wearing walker gut ponchos, walk out forming a chain, and then Jesse's youngest starts calling out mom. Really quick 2 side notes. I really like how they're portraying Michonne in the show. In the show, she doesn't exactly know why she's there or what she truly wants, and we see the same thing in the comics. Obviously, it's not completely the same, but Michonne really struggles with what she deserves and what she truly wants. And I really like that they have a little bit of a parallel between the psyches of show Michonne versus comics Michonne. And I'm really interested if they're going to start bringing out more of comic Michonne's maybe characteristics and feelings on what she deserves and what she doesn't, and the relationship struggles she goes through. And then lastly, we got confirmation in the mid-season finale that Glenn did in fact know Maggie was pregnant. It happened a little bit different in the comics. Glenn comes back from a mission and Maggie tells him that she's pregnant, and in the show we never see the announcement, but I really don't think that's a big deal, and we didn't really need to see it. So that was Comics vs. Show for Season 6, Episodes 7 and 8. Make sure you come back for Walking Dead videos, Star Wars videos, comic videos, and also Game of Thrones history.